Today, let's take a look at the Destiny community and what they're saying about Edge of Fate. Of course, if we're referencing social media, Reddit, YouTube, anything like that, it tends to be the case that negative commentary is more popular than positive commentary. Part of that is human psychology. The other component of it, of course, is that social media likes controversy. Whenever you've got controversy, you'll get more engagement. So most of the platforms tend to push more of that than they do positive commentary. It is unfortunately the case, though, that if you're looking for a general sense of what the community and players are talking about, you will see more negativity than anything else. So first, some things I like about Edge of Fate. The fully upgraded Matter Spark is actually a little bit fun. I'm not saying Matter Spark is awesome, but I actually don't mind the version when it gets Jolt and all that. I am, however, less of a fan of it being a mechanic required for a bunch of the activity content. Speaking of Kepler activity content, I've actually had a lot of fun with the Mythic campaign. Bullet Sponge bosses is not like the primary thing I want to spend my time playing against in Destiny, I'll be completely honest, but having a challenge that sits within the window of the quest for Mythic Kepler actually is pretty fun. Plus there are just a couple of opportunities to get higher tier rewards earlier on in the power climb by doing that Mythic stuff. I do agree with the feedback though that getting reskinned Alkane Dust or whatever it's called as one of the primary rewards for this, yeah, it doesn't really feel great, does it? I totally get that. And outside of the contest and the conversation around difficulty and indeed the bugs in the Desert Perpetual, I've actually found it to be a somewhat refreshing experience, not too mechanic heavy, but also not as bullet spongy as some of the other content in the game right now. That's my experience without having ever played it on contest. I didn't even try it, and I'm glad I didn't. It was just too much from what I've seen. I also do like the general sense that there is a bit of grind in Destiny as well right now. I'm feeling that bit of a hook making me want to play the game more. But I do recognise the issues with power levels, tiered rewards, and the portal and how limited this sort of content offering is at the minute. Before I get a whole bunch of people calling me a shill, saying you streamers never tell Bungie how it really is, well, I've made numerous videos on my concerns with the current systems in the game. I've been fairly critical of how linear progression is at the minute, and sometimes the unnecessary amounts of difficulty or grind involved with actually improving your rewards. I'd also like to point out, though, that when I first saw the systems Bungie were implementing, like seasonal power, tying tiers to power levels, I was one of the first people to actually say, I'm not sure if this is going to work, and I'd said that like a month and a half before Edge of Fate even dropped, referring to Bungie obviously wanting to get more engagement and potentially elements of FOMO playing into the new systems. So I think I've done about as much as I can without quitting the game and having a tantrum to actually give Bungie that feedback, and I've been consistent with it from before Edge of Fate even came out. So I don't accept the idea that I'm simply supporting anything that Bungie do without offering feedback or trying to reflect more general feedback from players in the community. I've done what I can on that front. If Bungie choose not to react to those kinds of things from the community at large, then that's not really my fault. Moving over to some of the social media stuff though. Looking at Reddit here, the coil in Edge of Fate is the perfect example of how out of touch Bungie is with the community. And players talk about how their seasonal activity kind of rivaled GMs with regards to Ascendant Shards and reward drops, and that's why we loved it. But re-adding the activity without a nod to the activity's generosity when it comes to material and loot drops just shows that Bungie completely misunderstood why that activity was so highly regarded in the community. And I kind of agree actually, Bungie have failed to recognise the sort of association between certain rewards and their original activities, right? Activities having their own agnostic drops, if you like. And that's the same piece of feedback I gave regarding Bungie adding dungeon encounters to the portal, which is something they plan to do later on in the year. If you're gonna do it, you've got to give some dungeon rewards that originally came from those pieces of content, but updated into the new system, because having loot drops specific to a piece of content, like the Rage, you know, if we were getting TechSec armor in Desert Perpetual, that would seem absolutely bonkers. So why would you do it when it comes to dungeons, or indeed older seasonal activities? To an extent, there's a big relationship between rewards and the specific activity they come from, so I actually agree with this piece of feedback. There's another one here. Solstice doesn't have an event mode anymore. Bungie wouldn't copy-paste the copy-paste event. Now Solstice is just extra modifiers in the portal and Team Scorched in PvP. I mean, perhaps the EAZ has just burned down. I think that's entirely possible given that people kept setting fire to things over there. On a serious note though, yeah, it does actually feel a bit weird. Obviously there is a massive amount of focus on portal things right now, and as we've discussed, that's very limited in terms of the actual activity offering that's currently available. And yet there's a lot of feedback about Guardian ranks being tied to tiered rewards for these events. And as I've said previously, I think challenge is really important in terms of dropping more powerful gear in the game, and not just the amount of grind that you do before you get to said challenge. But that ball is in Bungie's court, my friends. There's a thread about the pinnacles that were removed from the game in favour of the portal, and of course it is a reasonably long list. Now though, we don't have any lockouts on how much power we can earn, we can just keep going. I guess the issue really is more so that the grind is incredibly long, and because players are not feeling as rewarded as they should during that grind, and the power grind not really feeling like a solid piece of end game progression, I guess, for Destiny. That's why people are farming things like Caldera 6,000 times a day, because they feel like they have to get to the end to actually start earning valuable stuff, and that's why I made that comment about perhaps having some higher tier drops sprinkled in with a low drop chance at earlier power thresholds before you get to 400 power, because it would just give a bit more chase and a feeling of possibility in the loot system. But then lots of hardcore players were telling me that I was asking for things for free. If you ask for a 5% drop chance of something after 100 hours of investment, I'm sorry, how can anyone say that that is the equivalent of asking for it for free? Hard disagree on that sentiment, to be honest. This is a good question. Why are the hand cannon and trace rifles tier 3 if they don't get extra perks? The 2% extra damage that it would do at tier 2 for this season only isn't a good enough reason. Why not just make them actual tier 3s? It's kind of like the ones that you get for completing Fabled and Mythic Kepler stuff. I feel like Bungie have recognised there's going to be frustration if players feel like they can't get higher tier rewards. And so they've basically stuck the tier badge over certain pieces of gear that are fixed roles, but actually don't really meet the criteria of the tier that they are suggesting they are. Here's a more positive one. TechSec armor is like chromatic fire if it was good. Plus 200% damage to shields, 15% to constructs, and AoE disorient on shield break. Yes, I fully agree TechSec is very, very nice indeed. Set bonuses and potentially the stats, if Bungie get them fully improved, will be one of the wins for Edge of Fate. The conversation about the power grind continues. It needs to be changed if this is what Bungie expects us to do every 6 months. I agree the seasonal refresh part of it will definitely kill motivation for some players, because we know ahead of time that it's going to essentially go away and we'll have to repeat it. Power level at the moment really only serves as a pass to get you certain tiers of rewards in the game. I've already said how I feel about that one. In relation to what I was saying about potentially having higher tier drops very occasionally during the power grind, someone said here, players don't hate grinding for weapons, they hate leveling to get access to grind weapons and armor that are temporary. I do think that is a big root part of the problem. There's one here as well. Bungie, Tyson, please communicate with your community. And there's conversation about the game director and indeed Bungie being pretty quiet on a number of issues right now. Outside of the current grind for power, feedback around that and reward systems, I actually think Bungie have communicated reasonably well on the most part following the Edge of Fate launch. Now, I'm not saying everything's perfect. I'm probably going to get flamed for this, but with regards to bugs, issues with the stat system, and indeed things like the raid, Bungie were actually reasonably fast discussing those problems and acknowledging feedback about them. I think because we have what feels like a much bigger problem to a lot of players with the power and reward system, and the fact that Bungie haven't said much about that, obviously, in that regard, because this system is so big, it is actually relatively early days. I do think that Bungie need to acknowledge it and have a high-level discussion about whether they'll consider any changes for it. And I really hope they do it soon. I've already said that, but given the other fires that Bungie have been putting out in terms of making what they've already released fundamentally work as well as it can, I think that's one of the reasons that this is going to take a little bit more time. I do agree though, we need to get that communication, and we probably will. There are other issues though, like with the Arms Week event, Bungie didn't say anything about earning XP, whether we get additional challenges for that event track. They kept quiet about it for like 48 hours after the launch, then suddenly said, we've resolved an issue where portal activities are not giving XP. They now are, by the way, so if you want to rank up that path, you can go ahead and start making more progress. But it's definitely the case that sometimes Bungie take too long, and you're asking the question, why have you let this happen for 48 hours? Kind of like what they did with Encore being busted a couple of weeks ago and dropping way too much loot. They allow it to go on for too long and then kind of move the goalposts on it. So some things need attention way quicker than what they're getting. And the Arms Week issue this week is a clear example of that, in my opinion. Other feedback, solo ops is the best and worst thing about Edge of Fate. there's going to be the word caldera in here, surely. There actually isn't. Wow. But I think solo ops is a really good thing to have in the game. There's loads of reasons that that's a major positive. As we've discussed, I think players get bored of it because there's this sense that some players want to just farm caldera for hours and hours on end, because it is one of the most efficient ways to actually level up in this expansion. That's a problem for Bungie to fix in terms of refactoring the rewards in other encounters and potentially speeding up that power climb, right? It's another reason Bungie are going to have to do it, because if they say, oh, we're going to disable caldera because it's too effective, that would be the wrong move for the current community sentiment. Progression in general maybe should be sped up a little bit. Other activities though, things like pinnacles, the conquest stuff, whatever it is, the best option will probably be to improve those instead of nerfing other things. So there we go, that's a selection of the top stuff from the Destiny Reddit. If you look on other social platforms, you get a pretty similar type of feedback in general. In fact, things like X or Twitter, if you're old like me, you get similar feedback, but if anything, it tends to be more of a cesspool than what things like Reddit are. Not because feedback is negative or critical, but because people tend to get away with acting shittier, let's be real. So obviously you're going to find that. I don't think there's a justification for being directly unpleasant to individuals who work at Bungie. As we've seen in the past, that's a direct reason that Bungie tend to communicate less with players of Destiny. So despite the issues right now, definitely remember, Destiny is made by human beings. Human beings make mistakes. As we've seen, they can make a lot of mistakes. I do think though, most of the issues with Edge of Fate and the current kind of setup for Destiny, they are higher level problems as opposed to things that developers on the floor are doing, which are just simply bad. I think there has been a directive from high up in Bungie that says we need to get people engaged with Destiny for longer and over longer periods of time. I thoroughly believe that's the reason that a lot of the changes have been implemented in the way that they have. I don't think it's your average systems designer sitting on the floor and going into meetings saying, I think we should make this mechanic really crappy. I just can't see it personally. Most of the Bungie developers are actually pretty passionate and want the game to be fun. Safe to say Bungie are going through a lot. And the vast majority of that is because decisions higher up in the company have been pretty cracked for a long time. So there we go, guys. I hope you found this discussion interesting. Chime in with your 2 cents down below. If you felt like it, a rating below really does help us out as well. If you want more commentary like this and actual coverage for new Destiny content, then feel free to hit subscribe. Otherwise though, thanks for watching. Do what makes you happy, man, and I will catch you guys very soon.